Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar, Clarifying Overtime Requirements. Are you paying your employees correctly? This is a webinar brought to you by AIA Risk Management Committee. Before we get started, there's a few administrative items that we're going to cover. You will be receiving a follow-up email by the end of the week with the recording from today's session, along with a PDF of the PowerPoint, so look for that. This course is protected by U.S. and international copyright laws, and it is registered for one AIA CES learning unit. When you registered for the course, you entered your AIA member number, and we will use that information to report your credit directly to the AIA. So please allow at least 2 weeks for the credit to appear on your online transcript. But again, once you registered, you entered your AIA member number. At that time, we'll use that information to report your credit. With no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters. Ed, please let's start with you and introduce yourself to our audience.
Okay, I'm Ed Hord. I'm a senior principal at Hord, Copeland & Mocht, which is a firm of about 325 people with 4 offices around the country, and I'm headquartered here in Baltimore.
I'm Michael Prifty. I'm managing principal of BLT Architects, a single office in Philadelphia, 40 architects currently, multi-portfolio firm. And the two of us are both on the Risk Management Committee. Ed is currently the chair, and I'm the incoming chair-elect. So today we're going to really give an overview of Department of Labor requirements for overtime with regard to the spectrum of employees at an architectural firm. And it's really important to know the difference between exempt and non-exempt as it makes relevance to the requirement to pay overtime. And we'll also be talking about compensatory time and some of the mechanisms that many firms use as a method of not paying time and a half. Next topic, please. So what really is the issue? You know, everybody has to be consistent with federal regulations, but at the same time, we all know that we want to manage the costs of doing business, of practicing, and the primary cost we all have is payroll. So the aspect or prospect of paying time and a half to a significant number of people on staff could be daunting. And we also know that from a recruitment point of view, some firms do pay time and a half, some don't, and that new emerging professionals can be quite confused when they're trying to weigh an employment offer. So it's important for competitive positioning that we really understand what the law requires.
For example, if we have if you're offering somebody $10 an hour, $20 an hour, and paying time and a half, their total salary for the year actually might be much higher than someone who's paying $22 an hour. So they think that if they get a $22 an hour offer, they're better than you. But what they don't understand is the other firm might not be paying the overtime number.
And then you fold in the legality of all those notions and what's appropriate.
Yep.
Next.
So how is overtime paid? 40 hours, basically paying. You need to pay people direct time for up to 40 hours a week. Any hour over the 40 hours is considered overtime and must be paid time and a half at a rate of 1.5 times the salary, unless they're exempt. And exempt is a word that we'll talk about because that is exempt and non-exempt are legal terms from the Fair Labor Standards Act that you should understand. There are several categories.
Next, please.
There are several categories for that apply to all firms in terms of how they classify exempt and non-exempt and their qualifications for each of them. The categories are professional, administrative, sales, executive, and computers. The professional, the professional is pretty much what every firm has. I mean, we all have, the majority of the people in any firm will be determined exempt or non-exempt from the professional category. However, all firms have administrative people, and they all have executives, and some have computer IT, some not. And there are a few people have, the very large firms will have outside salespeople who are never in the office, who only go out on the road and sell. But that's a pretty unusual position for an architectural firm.
Next.
Could we have a little a straw poll? I'm going to ask a couple of questions. And Hasti, if you could report to me what the answer is on each of these, what the results are. Who pays all their employees overtime? Or who pays all their employees salary with absolutely no overtime?
Hasti, is this the part where you encourage everybody to click one of the choices here?
Absolutely. So we have some information coming in. So far, we've got about 50% pay their employee salary, no overtime. 20% pay a flat hourly rate. 6% are offering comp time in lieu of overtime. 11% roughly pay time and a half for overtime. And about 24% have a combination.
So it seems to me that when we get further into the PowerPoint here, people will realize that they might be at some considerable risk.
And what is the risk? The biggest risk that you have, can we go on to the next slide, please?
Forward 2, please.
What is your risk? The federal overtime rules aren't so crystal clear that you can say, absolutely, that person's exempt, that person's not exempt. Because there are a number of qualifiers in each of the categories that need to be met in order for a person to be non-exempt. Some of them are very simple, others are very nuanced, and you really need to understand it. The other thing you need to remember is that employees can drop a dime on you at any time. An employee that you have laid off who's angry at you, if you've been paying them only straight time or no overtime at all for everybody, and they're not exempt, then I think you've got a real problem, because if they report you to the Department of Labor, it's not just that you have to go pay that person. They come in and audit you, and they audit every single person in your office, your practices, your standards. They look for, is this a pattern of avoiding the law or violating the law? And if they are, they can find you can have to pay all of the back pay for people going back a number of years. Plus, you can have fines depending on how egregious the Department of Labor thinks that your violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act is. So just be careful. People can leave. People leave that are angry and want to strike out. Others just say, hey, I could get money. I was not paid properly. So at any rate, this is a very serious issue. It's something that can cost you a lot more than the overtime at the end of the day.
Next.
So everyone wants to do the right thing. No one wants to violate the law. We all would like to save money, but we know that violating the law will be a problem. One of the criteria that the Department of Labor has is that there's a ceiling or a floor that anyone below $35,568, this is starting January 1st, or $684 a week, are exempt from overtime pay if you make more of that. That's one of the tests for each of the categories that we talked about before. So, and this is subject to change, so you should always be checking this. But if you look at the AI salary calculator, which is on the next slide, you see that everyone is above that $35,000 number based on the standard salaries that come from AIA. This is from the AIA salary calculator that's done from surveys of what people are paying people right now.
Brand new for 2019, so this is fresh data.
Yeah. So these employees, if you look at this, you say, hey, I'm fine. I pay everybody more than the $35,000. Everyone can be exempt. So not quite true. So
Next, please. You wouldn't be listening to the webinar if you didn't think there was something to it. So it's not simple, because the salary number is only one part of the determination. And there are a number of requirements for professional staff. There are differing ones for administrative, executive, computer, and outside sales, but we're primarily concentrating on professional category of labor. Next, please. So, Ed talked about the need to have a base compensation greater than $35,000. Any graduate from a NAAB accredited program is certainly going to be making more than that, and you'd say, oh, they ought to be salaried. They also show advanced knowledge in a field of science or learning. After all, they've got a Bachelor of Architecture or a Master of Architecture degree, and that is coming through their prolonged course of education. And their primary duty, although they may be doing a lot of Revit work most of the time, is predicated on that education. So you'd say, oh, well, based on these definitions, we're still pretty good, right? So the first criteria, next, please.
Well, why don't we go back to that last
sure.
criteria? Go back to that one slide back, Hosty. The employee's primary, and the fourth one is the one that's a little tricky.
This is the one where Ed and I and our two firms are identical in the way we treat pay. And we will encourage everyone on the webinar to think about what they're doing, because it isn't just that you've got the education and the pay. It has to do with that last phrase there, consistent exercise of discretion and judgment. So that comes down to the individual character of your office, the kinds of projects you're working on, and the responsibility that you may give a new graduate from an architectural program who in large firms are less likely to exercise discretion and judgment and be more within a large team environment versus a smaller firm where they may give greater responsibility to a new graduate. Next, please. So as we said, it's important to pay attention to the base compensation, $35,568. This is coming out under the current administration, and as Ed said, it takes effect January 1st of 2020. It had possibly been revised under the Obama administration, but those rules were rescinded. It's important that you always pay attention because the regulations can change at any time. Next, please. So, some examples.
The first is, what if I've got a person that's unlicensed, he's a graduate from an architectural school, but he has very little responsibility and very little experience, so you can't really give him a lot of responsibility. So he's really not independent, he's not doing much independent judgment, he's not making decisions, he's not running jobs. So that person would absolutely be non-exempt, and you should be paying anyone that's not really sort of running things or in charge of their own day-to-day activities as they should be non-exempt.
Now, Ned's example would characterize it as a large team with a $100 million mixed-use, multifamily, high-rise project where the emerging professional is the lowest individual on the team.
Or it could be a small project where they're doing drafting for someone else. So it's, I mean, you're probably not going to let them make decisions and do total design and do the detailing and everything else. They are people who are sort of need the help and direction and oversight of a more senior person.
So, and a different example is someone who has a number of years of experience, has been with your firm for a considerable amount of time. They just never got around to taking the licensing exam. Or it could be someone that also failed to take the licensing exam, has considerable experience, but they've joined your team and they have considerable responsibility and they are empowered. So the question is, in each of those two examples, what is the proper basis of pay when judged not by your firm, but by the Department of Labor?
And what they're going to look at, do those people exercise discretion, judgment, and sort of make their own decisions and work more independently. And the first case, I would say, you can have a very experienced inexperienced or very experienced licensed person who just is not engaged, or is a great drafter and can just sort of follow directions and do tasks, but they're not exercising judgment. So I would say in that case, that person might need to be paid overtime. That might not be an exempt person. And an unlicensed person could conceivably also could be an exempt person, because although they're not licensed, they're taking a great deal of responsibility, working independently and making good decisions. So it's not an easy one.
Next. So by extrapolating from those two examples, we would believe that many firms consider that an NAAB accredited degree means that employee is sufficiently discreet and has judgment, and therefore could be made an exempt individual and be made salaried. However, in some practices, people with such a degree may not have sufficient project responsibility to satisfy that second test, which is independence and judgment. Some firms, believing it's a safe choice, consider the criteria to be professional registration. Newly registered architects, however, still need to satisfy that second test of independence and judgment. Additionally, we've talked about the second example, that experienced yet unregistered architects may be trusted with project responsibilities to be classified as an exempt individual. So you can see it's really not black and white, it's quite gray. So to assure compliance, we have summarized some things that you should apply as lessons learned by many predecessors who have experienced the Department of Labor audits. You should take, no matter the size of your practice, have a clear set of job descriptions for your staff, that you apply these vigorously during hiring and performance reviews. You should have a very consistent policy with regard to promotions, especially if promotion of an individual involves an anticipated change from non-exempt to exempt. You're going to have to explain why somebody who has been making overtime is now salaried, and sometimes there's a perception issue that they're taking a step backwards. Third, and this may be difficult for smaller firms, but for Ed and my firm, we do this all the time, you engage your attorney and other knowledgeable advisors to review your firm's policies, your written policies.
The other thing to keep in mind is that the reason that you might want an attorney sort of reviewing what you're doing to see if they feel like you're following the law is that there's an overlay of local and state legislation which impacts this in some places.
Correct.
So you need to understand it. And it's good to talk to an attorney once in a while, because the law does change, and we are probably not reading all the laws that come through on labor law.
Right. So I would acknowledge that in managing my practice for 30 plus years, our policies have evolved. Mm-hmm. Just as the pay only occasionally changes, the interpretation of responsibility has changed, as well as the composition of our projects and how we staff those projects. So, next slide, please, Hasti. It's important to know that overtime in certain cases can be a staff incentive, because if you have a really energetic young intern architect, they will be willing to work longer hours with pay as an incentive. That can also be a challenging proposition for someone who is working a tremendous amount of hours on the threshold of how your firm changes them to become exempt, i.e. salaried. That's the concern, that they would think that they're taking a step backwards.
That's why usually in our firm, when we make someone exempt and they no longer get overtime, we usually give them a bump in salary, an increase in salary. And that's for two reasons. One is because they would be making less money and I don't want them leaving. And two, it's a good thing to do, and I think they deserve it. If they're really going to the exempt level, they've really grown professionally and are deserving of a raise.
So the third item here about part-time employees, it's important to know that if you are not exempt, you're being paid on an hourly basis. So if you're working part-time, you merely pay the hourly wage times the number of hours worked. On the other hand, if you're an exempt individual and you work part-time, recognize that the basis of pay is either on a daily basis, I'm paying you 60% because you work 3 days a week, or more often the case, you convert part-time people who ordinarily could be exempt, you pay them on an hourly basis since they're unlikely to work more than 40 hours. It's important really to understand how the Department of Labor judges the work week. It is 40 work hours in a week. It's not a daily rate. It's not a pay period. It's within a week. You could be paid weekly. You could be paid bi-weekly. You could be paid semi-monthly. But the Department of Labor is per week. And the 40 work hours are not inclusive of vacation, sick, or holiday times. So if you have a holiday, say the 4th of July, that's really a 32-hour work week, and the odds are there won't be overtime paid on that basis. Next, please. So it's time for another straw poll. Who offers comp time in lieu of overtime pay? And I know from the first poll, there are a number of firms who did say that.
Some do none of those.
And some do none. But
Yep.
So we are collecting responses. It is looking so far that 54% do comp time, and it's actually now 50-50, comp time and overtime.
okay, next slide.
Okay.
You can't do that. When we present, Ed and I presented this at conference, we're in a fishbowl on the trade show floor, and we remarked that the Department of Labor is in the next room. In your own offices, I doubt that's the case, but next slide, please. Comp time is not allowed in the private sector.
Period.
Period. There is no exception. There is no workaround to this. If you read the legislation, comp time is exclusively used for people in the public sector as a mechanism of managing their workload. It has absolutely no application for us in an architectural practice. So it's important that your written policies make it really clear. Now, if someone works 60 hours in a week, you may bonus them days off. You may do other things, but you cannot swap hour for hour.
Yeah. Never do it hour for hour. If someone works a lot, you can say, take a day off, take tomorrow off, you did a great job. But don't say, well, you worked 12 hours, so I'm going to give you 12 hours off. If you do that, you're starting to get into what would actually be called comp time, and which is illegal, and you can't do it.
Right.
It's seen as a way to avoid paying overtime. That, I can avoid the time and a half, I just let them, we'll do the comp time for the next week. But it's that 40-hour week that you've got to look at. So if you work, say 60 hours Monday through, you'll still have to pay the 40-hour overtime because you're over anything over 40 hours.
And there's a genuine risk to firms given the audit capacity of the Department of Labor. You may think that this is only oriented to people at the entry and low experience levels. But in fact, if you are a senior leader in the firm and you're working significant amount of time and your firm has a basis of offsetting those extra hours by way of comp time, then what you've just done is declared that every individual who is enjoying that so-called privilege is now a non-exempt individual, and even as a senior leader of the firm, you would be required to pay them time and a half even for a highly compensated individual. So that could be quite disastrous.
Even though they work 60 hours one week and only 20 hours the following week, that 2-week period is 80 hours, which is 40 and 40. But the Department of Labor only looks at week by week. So if it, 1 week was 60, they should have been paid a lot, paid the time and a half. The next week,
they pay them less.
Pay them less.
Okay, so we pause a little bit for questions. Steve, you'll tell us what people have on their mind.
So please enter any questions in the chat or question feature on the right-hand side. We do have one question here. What were the 5 categories? And if you'd like, I can pull that slide up. I believe it was earlier on.
Next slide would do it. Next slide would do it.
The very next slide.
Go next.
Oh, right here? Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on one moment.
There you go.
So it's professional, administrative, executive, sales, and computer IT are the 5 categories. There's also, the Department of Labor has a website with extensive information, do we have a link for that at the end? I don't remember.
We have a link for the Department of Labor. We also have a link for the risk management thing. And we'll say, if you go back to questions, we'll deal with these other 4 categories. Let's field questions specifically about professional category, i.e. architects, and in some cases, if firms have multidisciplinary engineers, interior designers will follow under the same guidelines.
Thing. They're all professionals, seen as professionals.
Okay, here is a question. What guarantees no overtime?
Have everyone work 40 hours a week. So that's a gross simplification. But to do are people that are, are exempt, that are senior people that are very qualified, running things that in your heart of hearts are independent. Those folks you can make exempt and not charge them overtime. But for the people who are young, who are inexperienced, who need supervision and direction, those folks, you've got to pay overtime, or they only work 40 hours a week. I mean, you can just say, we're not going to work any overtime. If you don't want to pay overtime, don't work it. But that's the only way to avoid it.
I think this is why we encourage a written policy. Many of us will know it when we see it. When there's a young professional who's just a ball of fire and they can work for days without anyone going and commenting. They know their way through the architectural world and can produce work in a timely way in anticipation for all future needs, client meetings, and the rest. If they're not able to do that, then they're not self-directed and should ordinarily be paid time and a half. So this is the part where, as you write out your job descriptions, it's a roadmap for your staff so they understand how they get promoted. It's also a criteria for you when you have your performance reviews to say whether or not you're going to promote somebody and whether or not they're going to get a modest raise because they haven't really grown professionally, or they get a very significant raise because they've accomplished some amazing things. Do we have another question?
Yes, so we have a question here. Where does an experienced CAD tech with a technical drafting degree typically fall?
In my opinion, unless they are creating detailing independently of anybody else, I would judge that person to be non-exempt and get time and a half.
Yeah.
They fail the criteria of having a highly, if we go back, I have to read the criteria, it's the highly educational threshold, which is...
Because all these, you can't just look at one of the 5 criteria, it's all of those criteria.
It would be the advanced knowledge is customarily acquired by a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction. That to me is a 5-year degree or a 4-year degree coupled with a master's degree on top of it.
It could be the BIM, a BIM specialist has a degree. I mean,
could be.
If that person has a degree of advanced learning, that they would be in the area of exempt if they're working independently. But again, it's not just one of those things. It's all 5 of them have to be met before a person can be exempt.
But we're going to reprise that question in a different form a little bit later when we get into the IT, computer IT category, because that's not so clear either. I have another question, Hasti?
We do have a few questions about the definition of exempt. So one attendee would like to see the definition of exempt again, and one attendee wanted to know what key responsibilities qualify someone as exempt, even as a junior employee.
Okay, so the definition of exempt would be, I guess, on slide 14 and 15.
Okay, let's
14.
go ahead.
Okay, so to answer the follow-on question, which is, and I'll talk about myself. When I graduated with a master's degree, I worked for a sole practitioner working in the guy's basement, and he did single-family homes, and he had me as, believe it or not, I was the guy's lead designer. And he would go out to the job sites, and I would see him every other day. And he relied on me to produce the design on trace paper and then to draw it up, and he would come in and red mark it. He could arguably have made me salaried under the current regulations. On the other hand, when I got to my current firm, I was still an intern on the cusp of registration, and I was this is manual drafting, there was no AutoCAD at the time. I was one of a team of 8. And I was working exclusively for the project architect, who basically checked in with me twice a day and was making sure I was making all the right progress as I learned a larger office's system of practice. There was no way that I could arguably made salaried on that basis, because I was really working at the direction of somebody who was coming by very frequently. Ed?
We have the same thing. The other thing you can look at is we also get people who come in with no degrees and are working very independently, but even with no degree, you're not making that, what was it on 14?
Yeah, 14.
Hold on, let me get back to the thing. You still don't have advanced knowledge as customarily acquired by a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction. Unless you do, I mean, you've got to hit all 5 of those. So all of those items have to be checked off in order to make it.
Yeah, then that becomes a risk proposition. You know, if you have, one non-degreed person out of 50, and it's a singular exception, you get some legal advice there. If, on the other hand, you have a practice the way some engineers do, where you have a handful of licensed professionals and a whole cohort of designers who have a lot of independence, with different kind of advice, you may choose to be pushy and make those folks exempt. I guess Ed and I are not here to tell you exactly what to do. It's really gray.
Well, there's no way that we could tell you that person or this person without a lot of review of what they're doing, what their actual tasks are, and what their responsibilities are, and what you do with them on a day-to-day basis. There's no way in this meeting we could say that person should be exempt, that person's not exempt. I think that's something you have to make your own decision on and probably get some legal advice, because legal advice is not bad. Those are professionals who can look at the law and advise you on it from the outside, which is probably, if you were ever audited, at least you can say, I went to my attorney, he reviewed this is what he said. They may say, well, your attorney's wrong, too bad, but at least what it does is shows you've done your due diligence and you weren't willfully violating the law. If you're willfully violating the law, I think the fine could be more substantial depending on how many people are involved.
Shall we go
here's
back?
a quote.
Okay.
Oh, sure. I will go back. If we can answer this question in the meantime, can you hire someone on an hourly basis and pay overtime during an introductory period, then promote them to salaried when they achieve the responsibility to have independent discretion and judgment?
Absolutely.
As long as they've met all the other check marks.
So as Ed alluded to, my firm is exactly the same. We are skewed heavily towards registered architects because of the emphasis we put on the exam, and we give people a bonus when they become registered. We give them a significant pay raise because it benefits the firm to be able to qualify them as fully licensed professionals. And so clearly, we make a celebratory event about it. We change their accounting, we change their category in accounting, we change their billing rate, and it's very advantageous to our firm.
Can the advanced knowledge requirement be met with an experience and not a degree?
I think yes, but I think it would depend on the advanced knowledge. I think you could, some states allow you to be licensed if you don't have an AB degree. Some don't, but if you do, if that person, I would encourage that person who's very talented, very good, very knowledgeable to take the exam if they can in the state.
It could be that if they don't have an NAAB degree, they can't do it. Now, in the olden days,
you should still do it in some states.
In some states,
it
you can still do it, and depends. And it used to be more universal, where you could go get it registered under the broadly experienced category, which did not necessitate an NAAB degree. That's states are weaning themselves from that ability. I think it really comes down to judgment and the kind of work the practice does and the categories of people that they choose to hire and the way they describe those categories.
One other thing I'd like to say before we go any further is we are not attorneys. This is not legal advice. This is just alerting you to an issue. And the nuance of each individual employee, and without knowing more about it, it's very difficult to make any concrete judgment on whether that person's exempt or not exempt. I think you really need to get into the details of what they're doing, how they're doing it, and probably look for some legal advice. I can't stress that enough, that don't go back and say, these guys told me to do it, so I'm doing it. I think you've got to talk to an attorney who understands the law, the federal labor law, as well as your local and state laws, because all of those could have impacts on it. And those do vary around the country.
I would add that if you're a sole practitioner, you have an extremely small practice, and you are loath to call up an attorney because you believe they're very expensive, then maybe you should go to an AIA event at your local chapter or your state, or possibly go to the national conference and go find a friend. And a friend who might be in a larger firm that has run this matter by attorneys, and you'll find pretty much far and away that anybody with a firm of 50 or greater is paying people time and a half, unless they have a very specific criteria and reason not to.
Well, I have talked to people in larger firms that don't know about this. So it's not always, I think most people in larger firms have heard, but not all. So I would go the legal route, and you could always talk and see what other people are doing, but at the end of the day, it depends on how much risk you want to take. And you just might have to pay at some point a lot of back pay and potentially fines.
We have a two-part question. Does billable time versus time spent in the office factor into the 40 hours a week? As in, they spend 6 hours of GO/non-billable and only bill 34 hours a week.
Has no relevance.
No, you're working. I mean,
you're working.
Administrative work time is time you're working. It's what they're putting in their timesheets, what they're going to look at. Administrative is administrative. Every firm, every person has to do something.
I would say non-billable.
Not every firm
still paid to the individual, even though you're not billing the client.
True. Yeah.
Right. And then you get into all kinds of oddities. If you do public work, then there's internal audits and what's the billing rate affecting because are you or are you not paying time and a half? That's a little too nuanced for this kind of webinar. That's very nuanced, and there not only need to talk to an attorney, you need to talk to your CPA as to how to respond to a public audit for that kind of work.
A question from another attendee. What if we are paying only by the hour and have not converted anyone to salary, all work 40 hours?
Well, if the people are working only 40 hours, you can pay them on an hourly basis. The 41st hour
should be time and a half.
Time and a half.
Another question, how does this work with the flexible work policy?
It's still, the Department of Labor is less concerned. You can be flexible in a 1 week period, but in any week of work, if you're spending more than 40 hours working, you should be paid time and a half if you're non-exempt.
Right.
For every hour over 40 hours. So you can be flexible, but you can work 10 hours one day, 2 hours the next, and at the end of the week you've got 40 hours, fine. If you've got 41, you should be paying them time and a half for that last hour.
Correct.
There are some jurisdictions that do this by day, so that I've heard that. So
we heard that in conference that in California,
I think that
they're much more particular. But you know, if you have summer hours and you say everyone will work 4 10-hour days and have Friday off,
it's still 40 hours a week.
40 hours in the work week.
Okay. Please do a quick recap of the definition of comp time and when we can use it in the private sector.
Never.
Well, you can never call it comp time. The only thing you can do that is if someone works, you know, and you want to reward them, you can say take off a day or two. What you can never do is call it comp time. You can never make it tit for tat. That if you have worked 48 hours 1 week, say you only work 32 the next, no. You can't tie it to the time off to the amount of overtime that you work, because you can't be, comp time's illegal. I mean,
comp time's illegal. If you cannot tally the hours and then directly have a direct link to the hours that you give time off. It's a round days worth of bonus that you give someone, hey, take a day off. You work really hard.
Well, there is one way you could do comp time. You can't call it comp time. But if someone worked 16 hours one day, you could say, just work up to 40 hours this week and then take the rest of the week off because you worked so hard that first part of the week. Because 40 hours is the measure. So conceivably, you just can't say the word comp time. Don't have it in your manual for the office. Your standards. You've got to be careful with that.
I think now we're getting down really in the weeds. I would say this is the part where the project architect or the project manager reviews the time cards. They are the steward of their project budgets. They should be well aware if your policies have non-exempt pay, i.e. time and a half. They should know that is going to hit their job, and they want to make sure that they are getting their money's worth for that effort. If you're on charrette and you have to make a deadline, okay, you're looking for performance for your salary or your pay dollar.
Okay, that looks like we've gotten through all of the questions.
Okay, so now take it away.
Now we're going to talk about some of the other exemptions. Go to the administrative, the executive, sales, and computer IT. First, the administrative exemption has the same, $35,586 or $684 a week starting January 1st. And their primary duty is the performance of office or non-manual work that's directly related to the management or general business operations of the firm or the firm's clients, and that their primary duty includes the exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. There are fewer things here, but it's the tough one is always number 3, which is the primary duty. That's that exercise of discretion and independent judgment with matters of significance, because it's the same thing as a professional in that respect. It doesn't have some of the other things. It has, both of them have number 1, which is the salary threshold, but this one is a little different. The item number 2 is a little more difficult to figure out, because it's you've got that you're doing work for the office that's in terms of the management and general business operations.
An easy example here is if you have an account or someone doing your bookkeeping and your invoicing, they clearly are operating pretty independently of the architectural teams and are exercising discretion and judgment in support of your practice. They could be made salaried. However, if you have an administrative person whose job is to make sure lunches are provided and bring coffee and to open the mail, that may not be sufficient discretion and independent judgment, since they are following protocols that your firm has established, and all they're doing is doing what they're asked.
And you might have on that person have a little difficulty with item 2, which is related to the management and general business operations. Well, you could probably make an argument for it.
Right. So, next.
The next is some other exceptions. Executive, I mean, pretty much anybody that's an executive in any firm is going to be exempt. That one's probably doesn't need much talking because they're running the firm.
It's typically ownership in the firm or C-level position. Could be an associate or some titled thing. And
the CEO, the president, all those folks are the executives. So the C group folks are. That's a pretty easy one, I think.
The next one is really tricky because if you get a firm of some medium size, you're likely to have someone dedicated for IT. That is not necessarily a salaried position. The salaried position is those who are creating computer systems and software, not putting new CPUs on the desktop or making sure that Revit is updated or giving training. It really is a more sophisticated level of that. However, you could argue that they are demonstrating leadership, judgment, and independence if they create your IT budget, they administer acquisition of capital items and other kinds of things. So again, that gets back to a written job description and legal advice that you get.
I would, if you're interested in the computer one, I would recommend going to the Department of Labor's website, or the Risk Management Committee has a good summary on their website that talks about this computer thing. There's a white paper on that. It's relatively short, links you to the Department of Labor. But I think that's, if you really want to get into the weeds on the computer item, I would go to the Risk Management's website or the Department of Labor's website.
Same thing's true for the sales category. I mean, as leaders of the firm, Ed, I, and those on the call are likely out closing and doing the work and are therefore in sales. But this, in the Department of Labor, really is for someone who is dedicated purely to sales, may have incentive compensation and lots of entertainment dollars at their disposal. So it is not typical that a firm has a person in this category. Next.
How do you protect yourself? Well, as Michael has said before, you need clear job descriptions and expectations, and you need to memorialize them in your office manual, and you want to make sure that you're following them consistently. Inconsistency can be a problem for you, because if they're there but you never follow them, or you follow it, when you think it feels comfortable, that's probably going to get you into trouble and in an audit situation. You ought to have a policy for when you move someone from being non-exempt to exempt. That's, again, documented, memorialized in your manual, and understood by your employees. The other thing I do is to talk to a labor lawyer, someone who understands employment law and labor law, who knows the jurisdiction that you're in and is capable of giving you good advice. And I would, either you or that attorney, the attorney would be monitoring the labor laws and would be able to help you. If you're not using an attorney, you ought to be looking every once in a while. And it's hard to see because, I'm in the business, I'm interested in this, and then this new thing came out, and I found out about it by an article someone sent me. So it's interesting that it's hard to keep up with that without having an attorney that you can talk to.
The last point is important to note that though the law and regulations may not change, and you are tremendously consistent in your internal policies, there could be a variation of enforcement by the Department of Labor, right? And of course, there is the unexpected employee that walks away disgruntled and, as Ed put it, drops a dime on you.
And you can be all right, but it's a matter of judgment, and it's the biggest problem I think you would have if you had a consistent pattern of avoiding of sort of sidestepping the law or not following the law. If you have a regular policy that's in violation of that, I think you could have a problem. Individuals that you miscategorized, once, for a few people in your office is a lot different than everyone in the office is salaried no matter what they do. If you do that, I think you're in trouble if you get an audit.
Next slide.
So what do you do if you get an audit? Well, the first thing I would do is seek some legal advice and get some help on it from accountants, from attorneys, people who know what they're doing, and have them represent you and advise you in your dealings with the Department of Labor. Because if they find you in violation, you can have to back pay not just to the employee that dropped the dime, but for every single employee in their office going back years, which could be, sometimes it's hundreds of thousands of dollars people have had to pay. It's a serious concern and not to be taken lightly.
And it's twofold. It could be just that the Department of Labor believes there's some error in the determination of exempt or non-exempt, or if you're one of the firms who admitted to doing comp time for even the highly paid individuals, they could determine that everybody in the whole studio is non-exempt, and then you're into colossal amounts of back pay.
Just be careful. I mean, it's a matter of judgment. You can think you're right. We could think you're right. Your attorney thinks you're right. The Department of Labor person that comes in might not agree with you. And it's something to think about. But at least if you have a consistent written procedure that you follow and you're consistent with it, I think you have a much better argument. You may have made a mistake on one person, okay, but it's not a broad pattern of violation of the law. Next. This is the AI's risk management website. There are a lot of good articles in here, and there are a whole series of articles on labor law and paying your people correctly, from comp time to the administrative, the professional. I mean, all of those are outlined in there.
Right, and these
in much more detail than we went into today.
Yeah, much more detail than we've discussed, and they also include the links to the Department of Labor for the relevant section. Mm-hmm. And as Ed and I are both members of the Risk Management Committee, we will admit that we do not have this web page updated to the current change in salary effective January 1st.
Well, they will be done shortly.
It'll be done very soon.
But it's not January 1st yet.
That's correct. We still have a few days.
All right. Any questions?
Next slide.
I don't see any additional questions coming into the chat. Please let us know if you do have any questions. Before we close, I just want to remind everyone that you will receive a follow-up email by the end of the week that has the recording of today's webinar, as well as the PowerPoint slides in PDF format. You'll also receive one learning unit for attending today's webinar. When you registered, you entered your AIA member number, and we will use that information to report your credit directly to the AIA, and it'll appear on your online transcript within 2 business weeks. I don't see any additional questions coming into the chat. So I do want to thank our presenters for today's thoughtful and comprehensive presentation on overtime requirements. I also want to thank all of our attendees for taking the time to participate. Again, if you have any questions, please let us know when you receive the follow-up email. So again, thanks to all. And actually, there is one more question, and I think we do have about 5 minutes to answer. If you want to make corrections, should you change a non-exempt employee to hourly, or can you just pay bonus time and 1.5 on top of their regular salary?
I think if they're not exempt, you should be paying them, you should change them to hourly and pay them time and a half. If they're exempt, you don't have to worry about it. If they're not exempt, I don't think there's any real workaround except to pay them correctly.
Would you ask that question again, Hasti, and make sure I understood it?
Sure. If you want to make corrections, should you change a non-exempt employee to hourly, or can you just pay bonus time and a half on top of their regular salary?
You can't pay bonus time on top of the salary unless you have a policy that pays bonuses. You can't take time and a half. You can't take the extra time and a half pay and call it a bonus. It's pay.
You need to pay, and it's this 40-hour-a-week thing. So it's very hard to. I don't know how you'd go back. Except go back for every the time they'd worked, and pay them time, and you could give them a bonus for past time, conceivably. I think what I would do. Well, I'm not sure. I think I would talk to an attorney.
I would talk to an attorney and say.
What do you think I should do?
When there was a change in administrations once. We were advised, our attorney advised us that there would be more, they anticipated more challenges from the Department of Labor. And what we did was we expanded the number of non-exempt people in the office. And we're fairly transparent about how we did it and gave a presentation and couched it as it would increase everyone's compensation, and it was a scripted remark that was read verbatim by yours truly so that it would be defensible should anybody become disgruntled. So if you convert somebody from salary to now time and a half, that is something you have to give a lot of thought to. Right?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to do that in a way
that is very tricky.
Yeah. Other than, I would immediately, if you're not paying any overtime, I would immediately put the people that you think should be in the non-exempt category on a salary and pay them time and a half. I don't know what to do about going back. I think you talk to an attorney about that and see what their advice would be.
Okay, again, thank you very much to our presenters for taking the time to present today, and thank you to all of our attendees. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.